On the night of November 9, 1980, New Orleans Police Department officer Gregory Newport was shot and killed while on patrol near Fisher Projects in Algiers. According to contemporaneous coverage in Times-Picayune and UPI, officers responding to the scene came under additional fire from the upper floors of Fisher's 13-story high-rise. In the days that followed, police units swept through the surrounding low-rises. 7 civilians were killed. Subsequent investigations, including Orleans Parish, grand jury reviews, and civil rights suits in federal court, confirmed that none of the 7 were proven to have been involved in Newport's murder. Local papers and attorneys later referred to the episode as the Algiers 7. Fisher had opened in 1964, designed as a modern public housing complex for roughly 1,200 families. 1 high-rise and several 2- and 3-story blocks. Early years were stable. By the 1970s, unemployment, inadequate maintenance, and crime had reshaped the area. City records and HUD audits documented chronic elevator failures, vandalized lighting, and long-term vacancies on upper floors. Public transit routes were shortened around the site, and mail delivery became inconsistent. By the mid-1990s, Fisher was designated for clearance under the federal Hope 6 program. Demolition began in 1996 and concluded in 2007. Replaced by the estates at Fisher, rows of pastel townhouses marketed as mixed-income renewal. For officials, it was an urban planning victory. For former residents, it was the erasure of a neighborhood defined by one of the most violent chapters in New Orleans housing history. When the Norman Blumberg apartments fell in 2016, crowds gathered to watch. Some cheered. Others stood silently as the towers crumbled into a cloud of dust and memory. For the city, it was a new beginning. For North Philadelphia, it was the closing of a 40-year wound. Completed in 1967, in the Sharswood neighborhood, the Blumberg complex consisted of 2 18-story high-rises and several low-rise buildings. It was meant to symbolize modern progress for the city's working-class Black families, an affordable gateway to better living conditions near downtown. Within 10 years, that optimism had vanished. Federal audits and housing authority records from the 1970s already listed the site among the most distressed in Philadelphia. Elevators failed for weeks at a time, trash chutes jammed, and corridors went unlit. The Philadelphia Inquirer described the complex in 1982 as a vertical slum in slow motion. That same year, tragedy struck when a 4-year-old boy fell from the 13th floor window of his family's apartment. The death drew attention to the neglected conditions inside the buildings and led to calls for inspections and emergency safety measures. The city promised repairs. Few ever came. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the towers had become open-air drug markets, dominated by heroin and crack distribution. Police patrols were sporadic, and residents spoke of hearing gunfire nightly. The 1990 HUD report listed Blumberg among the 5 most violent public housing developments in the state. When demolition was finally scheduled under the $500 million Sharswood Blumberg redevelopment plan, it was described as the largest single transformation in Philadelphia public housing history. The implosion took place in March 2016. Television footage showed the Twin Towers collapsing inward, leaving behind a gray skyline and decades of displacement. Today, new mixed-income townhomes stand on the site. City officials call it rebirth. Longtime residents call it removal. In the end, the towers that were supposed to elevate a neighborhood became their own monument to failure. On December 12, 1980, an explosion ripped through the daycare center inside the Bowen Homes housing project on Atlanta's northwest side. The blast killed several young children and injured others. Investigators later determined the cause, a leaking gas line that had gone unaddressed, despite multiple maintenance reports. For many Atlantans, that moment marked the day Bowen stopped being just another struggling project and became a symbol of neglect. Bowen Homes opened in 1964 as one of the city's largest public housing developments, spread over 650 brick units. It was initially marketed as a haven for working-class families. Early photographs showed landscaped courtyards and freshly painted playgrounds. But within 2 decades, the optimism had disappeared. Industrial jobs in the surrounding area declined. Poverty rose, and the city's maintenance budget collapsed. By the 1970s, Bowen was one of the most underfunded sites in Atlanta's Housing Authority portfolio. The 1980 daycare tragedy drew national coverage. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that the gas line had been leaking for weeks, and that the previous requests for repairs were ignored. City officials called it a tragic accident, but residents described it as the result of years of neglect. Following the explosion, fire marshals condemned multiple buildings for unsafe wiring and infrastructure failure. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Bowen became synonymous with violent crime and open-air drug trade. Police response logs show dozens of assaults and shootings annually. A 1995 HUD inspection listed Bowen as severely distressed, citing vandalized units and uninhabitable interiors. Residents began relocating through Section 8 programs long before the city announced full demolition. In 2009, under the Hope 6 redevelopment initiative, the last remaining structures were torn down. News footage showed former residents watching from a distance as the walls collapsed. For Atlanta, it marked the official end of its last major family-oriented project. For those displaced, it was another cycle of demolition disguised as progress. When the Stella Wright homes opened in 1959, they were presented as a model of progress. Over 1,100 apartments stretched across Newark's Central Ward, brick towers, manicured lawns, and a promise of dignity for working-class black families leaving the city's aging tenements. Newark officials called it a fresh start for families who've waited too long. It didn't last. By the early 1970s, the same design praised as efficient had turned against its residents. The elevators failed weekly. Power outages left entire floors dark for nights at a time. The Newark Housing Authority struggled to fund repairs as the city's finances collapsed. Stairwells reeked of urine and candle smoke. Rats and pigeons filled the gaps that maintenance no longer covered. Crime followed the neglect. Police reports from the mid-1970s listed frequent robberies and assaults within the towers. Residents began boarding their own doors from the inside. In 1974, a Newark City Housing Committee named Stella Wright among the 10 most hazardous housing environments in the United States. Firefighters and EMTs entered the site only in groups, often escorted by police. Federal records show that in 1980, the Department of Housing and Urban Development classified the complex as severely distressed. Residents organized protests, demanding demolition. The Star-Ledger covered one demonstration in which tenants held signs reading, "Tear it down before it kills us." Through the 1980s and 1990s, conditions worsened. Many families moved out voluntarily. Others were relocated under court-supervised consent decrees after reports of lead and asbestos contamination. When the demolition finally began in 2002, the last residents watched from a fence perimeter as dynamite reduced the buildings to dust. The land remains largely undeveloped. City officials call it a blank slate for the future. For former residents, it's a graveyard for promises no one kept. On April 8, 2015, city inspectors entered a boarded-up apartment in Foot Homes complex during a pre-demolition sweep. Inside, they discovered the body of a man who had been dead for months. The finding made local headlines, but for South Memphis residents, it only confirmed what they already believed. The last public housing project in the city had been dying for years. Foot Homes opened in 1940 as a part of a New Deal initiative to provide affordable housing for black families shut out of segregated neighborhoods. For decades, it was considered a stable community. Churches and small shops surrounded its red brick buildings, and generations of families stayed within walking distance of Beale Street. By the late 1980s, however, the decline of manufacturing and spread of narcotics reshaped South Memphis. Police records showed that by the mid-1990s, Foot was a hot zone for drug activity and gang rivalries. Memphis Police Department community crime reports identify a consistent presence of gangster disciples, vice lords, and the Rolling 20 Crips, whose younger members operated under a local offshoot known as Babyfoot. Multiple shootings between 1992 and 1997 linked the complex to violent disputes with crews from nearby Lemoyne Gardens and Dixie Homes. As violence rose, the buildings themselves decayed. A 2010 commercial appeal report documented burst heating lines that flooded several apartments with scalding water, hospitalizing 2 residents. City maintenance logs listed dozens of outstanding plumbing and electrical complaints. In 2013, Memphis announced the South City Redevelopment, a $250 million plan funded through HUD's Choice Neighborhoods program to demolish Foot and replace it with mixed-income housing. Officials promised that all residents would have the right to return. Public records requests later show fewer than 1/3 ever did. Demolition began in 2016. Local television footage showed dust clouds rolling across 4th Street as the last walls collapsed. For city leaders, it marked renewal. For the families who watched from the sidewalks, it marked erasure. The end of the last surviving link to Memphis's original public housing experiment. The night of September 12, 2023 was unremarkable for most of Cleveland, but on the city's west side, one thing was clear from the moment the shots rang out. This wasn't random. A stolen Honda Pilot had eased down a residential street just before midnight. It wasn't recklessly fishtailing, and it wasn't blaring music. It moved like a car with a purpose. 4 members of a gang calling itself the Fully Blooded Felons were inside that vehicle. Among them, Raven Dunny Mullins, Henry Noodles Burchett, James Flock Clemens. The indictment describes what happened next as a targeted killing in aid of racketeering. When the victim, 35-year-old Ahmad Issa Faraj, stepped outside, the crew allegedly moved fast. Neighbors later reported a single burst of gunfire, then silence. The kind where people stay inside and wait for sirens to tell them it's safe to look outside. The victim collapsed in the street. The Honda Pilot sped off. Within hours, that same SUV would be found burning in another part of the city. A move meant to erase fingerprints, DNA, and any trace of who was inside. By the time firefighters arrived, almost everything inside the vehicle was reduced to ash and metal. But the fire didn't burn away the bigger problem. For Cleveland police and federal investigators, it was the final pattern match. The final link in a chain of violent acts that investigators have been tracking for almost 2 years. This murder gave them what they needed, a clean entry point into a sprawling criminal enterprise that had quietly grown from a small Cedar Estates street crew into something far more structured, violent, and ambitious. A group that called itself the Fully Blooded Felons, a group prosecutors say operated like a family, enforced like a militia, and expanded like a business. From Cleveland's east side to Akron, to Youngstown, and even into the state's prison system. And this killing, this one night in 2023, is what finally pushed the federal government to unseal one of the biggest gang indictments in recent Cleveland history. Because what looked like a single late-night execution was anything but isolated. It was a symptom of a gang that law enforcement says was running an open-air fentanyl market, coordinating violent retaliation, recruiting inside prisons, and establishing its own hierarchy across multiple cities. This murder wasn't the story. It was the moment the story cracked open. Cleveland's east side has seen crews come and go for decades, but by the early 2020s, One spot in particular had become the center of gravity for a new kind of operation. Cedar Estates, public housing complex tucked just east of downtown. For years, it had the usual mix of neighborhood tension, open stairwells, dim courtyards, and corners that changed hands depending on who had the most momentum that season. But federal investigators say something shifted when the fully blooded felons tightened their grip on the area. They gained control of supply, space, and traffic. The FBF leadership set up a constant flow fentanyl market inside Cedar Estates. A rotation of members handled shifts, stashed cars, and 2 stashed apartments kept the product moving. Buyers knew exactly where to go: the courtyard and the grassy patch beside the 28th Street liquor store. Fentanyl, meth, cocaine, and buprenorphine, aka subs. Those were the core products. Each had its own price point and demand stream, and each contributed to a steady income engine. The gang wasn't huge. What made them dangerous was their structure. You had Dunny, who handled both street-level and higher-level coordination. You had Noodles, deeply involved in the drug side and violence. Then Flock, tied into the group's enforcement and communications. Below them, a web of distributors and couriers: Jeffrey Fatty Lee, Jarrell Ruger Farrell, Devontae D-Nut Johnson, Elijah Loon Johnson, Jerome J.T. Williams. Each name reappears across indictments for some combination of drug conspiracy, gun possession, or running communications for the crew. But the part that stands out most, the part the feds kept emphasizing, is how organized the operation was for a local gang. This wasn't random corner dealing. This was a pipeline, and Cedar Estates was the storefront. Dealers operated with armed security nearby. Firearms were staged in apartments and cars placed where someone could reach them fast if a robbery or dispute broke out. Lookouts watched movement in and out of the complex. But the real indictor of how deep FBF had embedded itself was simple. Nothing happened in Cedar Estates without someone from the gang knowing about it. Residents told officers the drug activity didn't come and go. It was there, every day, all day. And the money flowing through the complex gave FBF something every gang wants, but few achieve: a stable base. A place where supply chains, cash flow, and manpower could cycle without interruption. From this base, they expanded outward, first into other parts of Cleveland, then Akron, then Youngstown, and eventually, according to prosecutors, into the Ohio prison system itself. The next phase wasn't just about selling more drugs. It was about building a system that could survive arrests, turf disputes, or street-level crackdowns. A system that ran even when members were locked up. Cedar Estates was the beginning, and now the prison pipeline was the evolution. When most street crews talk about running the system, it's just bravado. Jail is usually a dead end. Lines get cut, money dries up, and whatever influence a gang had outside rarely survives inside. But the fully blooded felons were an exception. Their next move was a foothold inside a prison, and not just any prison. Northeast Ohio Correctional Center in Youngstown, the kind of place where different crews mix, old enemies cross paths, and entire hierarchies reset every day. Between January 2022 and April 2024, the indictment alleges that FBF members and associates built a full-scale drug pipeline operating behind the prison walls. The product list didn't change much from Cedar Estates, but the method was different. The indictment describes structure where inmates, outside suppliers, and even prison workers or people applying for prison jobs were allegedly used to move drugs through layers of security. The feds said the plan started with one idea. If the gang wanted control inside, they couldn't rely on random corruption or luck. They needed their own people in position. So, according to charging documents, leaders encouraged certain members or associates to seek employment inside the prison. Others allegedly acted as intermediaries, coordinating who brought in what, who distributed products on the cell blocks, and who reported back. Inside, the drugs moved through familiar channels, smuggled through staff, passed during inmate work details, hidden in common areas, and transferred hand-to-hand once cell doors closed for the night. Outside, members of the gang used prepaid phones, social media accounts, and contraband cell phones in the facility to keep the network running. The Youngstown indictment includes text logs and call records showing coded conversations about drops, deliveries, and quantities. Some messages were disguised as routine check-ins. Others were more blunt. To prosecutors, this wasn't a side hustle. It was a second market. A captive customer base where demand never slows, where drugs sell at inflated prices, and where the gang could maintain influence over inmates who might someday return to the street. And the advantage was obvious. If FBF controlled flow inside the facility, they controlled protection, debts, alliances, retaliation, and the future behavior of anyone who owed them. For investigators, the choice to push into a federal prison changed the tone of their case. A street operation trying to insulate itself by embedding inside a federal detention center was the kind of escalation that guaranteed a major response. By early 2024, federal agencies were tracking the network from both sides, the phones inside the prison and the movement of product outside it. Wiretaps, surveillance, postal inspections, and intercepted calls began piling up. And as the pieces came together, the feds realized something important. Murder on Cleveland's west side wasn't another random act in a violent summer. It was a part of this whole conspiracy. The FBF didn't hold their structure together with reputation alone. They enforced debts, discipline, and internal order with a level of violence that prosecutors say crossed from intimidation into outright coercion. One of the most serious allegations dates back to June 30th, 2022. On that day, prosecutors say Raven Mullins abducted a woman and held her captive for 6 days. The indictment alleges he kept her restrained inside a private residence, put a gun to her head multiple times, and sexually assaulted her. She was only able to escape after nearly a week. At the center of the part of the indictment were 3 women, each charged with kidnapping in aid of racketeering and assault in aid of racketeering. Adriana Ali Null, Maisha Action West, Kyla Yayo Tyler. Prosecutors accused them of participating in gang-directed retaliation, forcing victims into vehicles, beating them, and carrying out punishment on behalf of senior members. Together, these indictments form a pattern federal investigators say made FBF stand out. The murders, kidnappings, assaults, and intimidation weren't isolated. They were tied directly to the organization's structure, a structure that included a hierarchy resembling a traditional crime family. According to the indictment, the gang had a godfather, a set of rules called the Fully Five, a secondary code called the Fully Commandments, and a commission responsible for making internal decisions. The enforcement acts were part of that system. People who owed money, disobeyed orders, or threatened the operation faced consequences. The same applied to people inside the organization who jeopardized business or even argued with the wrong member. When federal prosecutors built their RICO case, this part of the story became essential. The violence tied the hierarchy together. The hierarchy tied the members together. And the pattern of retaliation tied the entire operation, Cedar Estates, Akron, Youngstown, the prison pipeline, and the 2023 murder, into one continuous criminal enterprise. This is where the case shifted from scattered street crimes to a full RICO case. When the fully blooded felons first emerged in Cedar Estates, the crimes they were tied to blended into the city's usual noise: shootings, drug sales, and late-night 911 calls that have been a part of Cleveland's landscape for years. But 2 things changed the way investigators looked at this crew. First was scale. Second was coordination. By 2022, federal task force were already tracking multiple fentanyl pipelines across Northeast Ohio, Some led through rural counties, some led through Akron, some circled around Cleveland's west side and into Lorain County. But one pipeline, the one running through Cedar Estates and feeding into Youngstown Prison, stood out. Because it didn't look like a scattered network, it looked organized. And that's when the federal dragnet widened. Federal filings show the investigation stretching across 2022, 2023, and 2024, with multiple agencies locking in on the same targets. FBI Cleveland, ATF, DEA, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio, OCDETF, Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Forces. Investigators weren't just watching individual dealers. They were mapping the entire structure: who supplied what, who collected money, who enforced debts, who communicated with the prison, and who controlled the violence. Phones were monitored, traffic stops were logged, transactions were diagrammed. Connections between the street market and the prison were repeatedly cross-checked. The gang's own habits made the job easier. FBF had a fixed base, Cedar Estates, a fixed network, Youngstown, and a fixed leadership circle whose names kept appearing in the same files. Every new arrest, every seized stash, every intercepted message kept pointing back to the same group, the fully blooded felons. After nearly 2 years of surveillance, controlled buys, intercepted messages, in coordination with prison investigators, federal prosecutors made their first public move. They unsealed a superseding indictment charging 15 members and associates of the fully blooded felons with fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and buprenorphine trafficking conspiracy. Firearms possession tied directly to the Cedar Estates market, and attempts to smuggle narcotics into the Northeast Ohio Correctional Center in Youngstown. The filing laid out how FBF used 2 specific apartments inside Cedar Estates as stash locations and sold drugs openly on the grassy area next to the 28th Street liquor store. It also described the prison component: coded phone calls, contraband cell phones, and associates applying for correctional jobs at the facility to strengthen the gang's foothold inside. The April indictment gave investigators leverage. It captured the drug market and the prison pipeline, but not the violence that held the organization together. Those charges were still being finalized. December 4th, 2024, the RICO indictment 8 months later, federal prosecutors returned with a far broader case. The second superseding indictment charged 18 defendants with the full racketeering conspiracy, now including the September 12, 2023 murder of Ahmad Issa Faraj on West 73rd Street and Clark Avenue, the June 22 kidnapping and sexual assault allegation against Raven Mullins, kidnapping and assault counts involving Adriana Null, Maisha West, and Kyla Tyler, the Cedar Estates drug operation, the Youngstown prison drug ring, and the gang's internal hierarchy. With this indictment, the government wasn't targeting isolated incidents. They were presenting the fully blooded felons as a single, coordinated criminal enterprise operating across Cleveland, Akron, and Youngstown, and extending into a private federal prison. Federal agents and prosecutors openly labeled FBF as one of the most significant gang threats in Northeast Ohio, not because of size, but because of structure. The federal case against the fully blooded felons is far from finished. Most of the people charged in December 2024 RICO indictment remain in custody, waiting for their day in court. The murder of Ahmad Issa Faraj, the June 2022 kidnapping case, and the other violent allegations will rise or fall on whatever evidence appears during trial. What the filings do show, clearly, is how deeply the gang was embedded across Cleveland. Cedar Estates will eventually shift. Another group will try to take space, or the market will break into smaller crews. The Youngstown prison pipeline may shut down, or someone else may attempt to rebuild it. For the fully blooded felons, the story is in limbo. Nothing is resolved yet. No verdicts, no closure. Just a crew that operated like a tight system, now forced into a process where nothing moves quickly, but everything eventually lands. Long before the shootings were connected, the organization behind them already built the structure that made the violence possible. It began with a supply line that moved hundreds of miles across the South. Members of the group traveled to Houston with cash and returned with heroin measured in kilos. They used Greyhound buses for the trips, carrying drugs and money through interstate routes that were cheap, consistent, and difficult to monitor. It was the kind of pipeline that allowed a corner crew to operate on a scale far larger than its neighborhood suggested. The money did not circulate only inside New Orleans. Court documents point to a stash house on the Mississippi coast, a property used to store cash, count proceeds, and protect high-value shipments when pressure was heavy at home. It gave the crew a hideout outside city limits and a place to keep its profits away from the streets where the product was sold. The weapons reflected the same level of planning. One rifle appears throughout the indictment, a Bushmaster 223 equipped with a double-drum magazine, holding around 100 rounds. Members called it Monkey Nuts. Monkey Nuts moved between different shooters and neighborhoods the gang had presence in. It was part of the enterprise's identity, a piece of hardware that represented planning, storage, and coordination. This system, the Houston line, the interstate transport, the Mississippi stash, and the shared firepower belonged to a single enterprise, one built from two local crews. The first was 3NG based around 3rd and Galvez in Central City. They controlled a steady heroin corner, had experienced shooters, and held a position in a neighborhood shaped by constant retaliation pressure. The second was G-Strip, based around Gallier Street in 9th Ward. They had their own customers, distribution network, and their own conflicts and project-based rivals in the area. The two crews unified to protect the heroin supply route, pool their shooters, and expand distribution across both territories. It functioned as a single organization, and by the time the first killings happened in 2010, the structure behind them was already in place. The system the crew built only made sense if more than one neighborhood supported it. 3NG had the corner at 3rd and Galvez, and they knew how to hold it under pressure. What they didn't have was room to grow. A single block couldn't handle a pipeline moving heroin in kilo amounts from Houston. G-Strip had the opposite problem. They controlled buyers in the 9th Ward and had reach in parts of the Desire and Florida corridor. But they fought for space constantly. The area around Gallier Street carried its own rivalries, and G-Strip didn't have the numbers to protect distribution while also dealing with crews around them. By early 2010, both groups were surrounded. Desire Project crews defended their territory fiercely because their heroin market depended on it. Ride or Die and Calliope linked groups moved through Uptown and the surrounding hoods, creating friction with both G-Strip and Central City. Younger factions like the clusters around Melpomene were rising at the same time, adding another layer of pressure. A single crew couldn't hold all of that, so 3NG and G-Strip combined their reach, their shooters, their customers, and their supply line. It wasn't a temporary arrangement. It became a system. Shared guns, shared money, and shared responsibility for whatever happened between their neighborhoods. That system is where the name came from. 3rd Ward plus 9th Ward, the 39ers. Once the alliance formed, every rival crew that affected either neighborhood, Desire, Ride or Die, Calliope, Uptown factions, became a part of the same conflict. From that point onward, the heroin economy stretched across the city, and the violence would follow that map. Once the alliance was in place, the group made a move that changed how the rest of the city responded. They crossed into the Desire projects with violent intent. On February 22, 2010, Kendall Favor was shot and killed in the Desire area. He was connected to the local crew that controlled heroin sales on that side of the 9th Ward. The 39ers sent members to carry out the hit, treating Desire as an obstacle to the supply line they were building. That choice had a price. Desire-based crews operated with their own internal order. If someone was taken out inside their territory, people noticed immediately. Favor's killing spread through the area fast, and it shifted how several groups interpreted what 3NG and 3-Strip were becoming. The alliance wasn't acting like a corner crew. They were moving with reach. That hit didn't just anger the people in the projects. It put the 39ers on the radar. They had crossed into the project politics, and that move always forced a response. The Alliance didn't slow down though. They saw the reaction, but they kept pushing outward. 3 months later, on May 11, 2010, Rayshawn Jones was killed. Jones had ties to people connected with Ride or Die, a crew that already had friction with both Central City and the Ninth Ward. His death confirmed something the earlier hit had suggested. The 39ers were targeting people who shaped heroin activity across the city. These two killings, Favor and Desire, in Jones and Uptown linked territory, were the Alliance's first major mistake. They removed rivals, but they also drew the attention of crews who had never viewed 3NG or G-Strip as a citywide presence. After these hits, they did. After the hits, the Alliance was no longer dealing with one neighborhood watching them. It had stepped into a web of long-running uptown rivalries that were tied to heroin money, old beefs, and who controlled movement near Central City. Groups linked to Calliope and Ride or Die did not need a formal declaration to respond. They already had friction with both 3NG and G-Strip. And Favor's killing confirmed something they had been suspecting. The Alliance was expanding fast. The pressure showed up in how people moved. Rival crews began showing presence closer to Central City blocks that the 39ers depended on. That shift forced them into a decision. Either absorb the challenge and risk losing ground, or hit back hard enough that the message traveled farther than the corner. On May 19, 2010, they chose the second option. 2 men tied to the Calliope Blink network were ambushed on a Central City block. Lester Green was killed, and Jamal Smith was shot but survived. That ambush changed the temperature of the war. Favor's death had been the first boundary crossing. Green's killing made it clear the Alliance would defend Central City by removing any opposition that crossed into their borders. Now it was a multi-front fight over where heroin could move, who could sell it, and which crews had the right to enforce those rules. By early 2011, the Alliance wasn't just reacting to rivals drifting toward its territory. It had started tracking people across the city with intention. Word moved faster, guns rotated faster, and their shooters relied on mobility rather than waiting for conflicts to reach their block. The shift became clear on February 19, 2011. Terrence Dennis was chased through Central City and shot multiple times. The 39ers had been talking about him for weeks, because he moved with groups whose presence had increased around their hood. The shift wasn't about where they found Dennis. It was how his name reached the top of the list. He was targeted because members inside the Alliance had been tracking who was showing up near their blocks, gaining influence, and who might disrupt their activity. Dennis was one of those names. The next day, February 20th, the Alliance carried out a second attack. Little John Haynes was approached with rifles and handguns, including monkey nuts. Haynes was connected to people with influence in parts of Uptown, where the Alliance tracked heroin activity. Taking him out one day after Dennis signaled that the group was now operating with the rhythm instead of reacting case by case. Around this time, the 39ers also learned how to use cars as a part of their strategy. Teams began following targets long enough to confirm movement patterns before making a move. They used more than one vehicle when possible, one to watch, one to close in, turning the street layout into an advantage. The violence increased because the enterprise had adopted a more efficient method of protecting its income. And once that shift happened, the conflict felt systematic. By mid-2011, the 39ers had perfected the pursuit style. The shooters used shared guns, rotating vehicles, and information that traveled quickly between Central City and the Ninth Ward. But the same system that helped them expand also made them easier to track. The first mistake was predictability. By that point, the 39ers attacked people who had influence in specific rival groups, and nearly all of those hits happened after someone inside the Alliance circulated a name. The pattern was tight. Identify a rival, confirm their movement, move in small teams. It worked on the street, but it created a rhythm investigators eventually learned to recognize. The second mistake was weapon circulation. The Bushmaster rifle monkey nuts didn't stay hidden. It moved between shootings too quickly, and its size and magazine made it stand out. Every time it showed up, it tied one incident to another, and the more the Alliance relied on it, the clearer the links became. The third mistake was the way they approached the final targets. On May 24, 2011, Gregory Keys was shot and killed, and Kendrick Smothers was wounded. Keys had been mentioned inside the Alliance because he moved with people involved in heroin activity near Central City, and consequently someone who could shift customers in the wrong direction. But the attack drew attention because it fit the developing pattern. Same gun, small crew, fast strike, familiar style. The killing that followed months later exposed the Alliance fully. On September 14, 2011, Michael Marshall was followed from his job to his car and shot before he could get in. The people involved trailed him long enough to confirm he was alone, then moved in on foot. That level of preparation matched earlier hits, and investigators began stacking the similarities. By late 2011, the 39ers were collapsing because rivals were overpowering them. They were collapsing because their methods had stopped evolving. What had once made the Alliance strong had become the outline of the case that would bring it down. By 2012, the Alliance wasn't the same crew that built the Houston line and moved the Bushmaster rifle through two neighborhoods. The break didn't start with one moment. It started with how the city had changed. Rivals who had once fought each other were paying closer attention to the 39ers. People talked. Information that used the same inside certain blocks now moved through the same streets the 39ers relied on. And every time a shared gun resurfaced or a pursuit played out the same way, more people understood who was behind it. The feds moved patiently. They watched the patterns, tracked the guns, and paid attention to who appeared after each incident. The case that formed wasn't built on one informant or one break. It was built on consistency. The same style, crews and names repeating across the city. In June 2015, the hammer dropped. A sweeping racketeering indictment named the 39ers outright as one organization. The trial that followed in 2017 brought the Alliance into the open. Witnesses described the Houston trips and the shared weapons. Others talked about where heroin moved and who enforced the rules. Some defendants fought the case. Others took pleas, and the people prosecutors considered central, those tied to the most serious violence, received life sentences. When the case closed, Central City and the Ninth Ward didn't transform overnight, but the version of the streets the 39ers had built, shared guns, pooled shooters, multi-neighborhood enforcement, faded. No group that came after managed to run the system the same way. Some tried, none replicated it. The 39ers didn't fall because their ops beat them. They failed because their own methods connected the dots for investigators. Once those links were visible, they had nothing left to hide behind. On the morning of October 30th, 2018, prison guards at USB Hazleton in West Virginia found one of America's most infamous informants lying on the floor of his cell. His name was James Whitey Bulger, the Boston mob boss who played both sides of the law for decades. His eyes had been gouged out, and his tongue was nearly severed. He was 89 years old. For years, Bulger had seemed untouchable. In South Boston, he ran the Winter Hill Gang, extortion, drugs, and murder, wrapped in Irish neighborhood politics. In secret, he was also a top-tier FBI informant, feeding agents dirt on the Italian mafia while using their protection to eliminate his own rivals. It was a partnership built on lies and blood. When that secret finally unraveled in the mid-1990s, Bulger disappeared. He spent 16 years on the run, living under aliases from Louisiana to California with his longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. The FBI eventually caught him in a Santa Monica apartment in 2011, hiding cash, guns, and the ghosts of nearly 20 unsolved killings. He was sentenced to life in 2013. Inside the federal system, Bulger's notoriety was a liability. He was elderly, frail, and universally hated by mobsters who despised informants, by prison staff who saw him as a political headache. Transfers kept him moving. Florida, Oklahoma, and finally USP Hazleton in West Virginia, a notoriously violent penitentiary nicknamed Misery Mountain. Within 24 hours of arrival, the contract was carried out. Investigators later named Fotios Freddy Gesh, a former Genovese crime family hitman serving a life sentence, as one of the attackers. Gesh was known for his hate for snitches. Security footage reportedly showed multiple inmates entering Bulger's cell while guards looked away. None intervened. The Bureau of Prisoners called it a homicide investigation, but to men inside Hazleton, and to many in Boston, it was poetic closure. Same system that had once protected Whitey Bulger finally delivered him to the only courtroom he couldn't manipulate. In Medellin, the name Griselda Blanco still carries a curse. The cocaine godmother built her empire on murder and migration, flooding Miami with Colombian cocaine through the 1970s and 80s, and burying anyone who crossed it. But the most brutal chapter of her story came years after she fell, when her own son learned what happens to the family of a snitch. Griselda had 4 sons, all raised in the shadows of her criminal dynasty. 3 of them died violently in the years after her arrest. The 4th, Michael Corleone Blanco, survived by reinventing himself. But before Michael's turn to legality, one of his brothers, Osvaldo Ozzy Trujillo Blanco, couldn't escape the family's past. In the mid-2000s, Osvaldo was living quietly in Medellin after his mother's deportation from the U.S. He had become a father, kept a low profile, and according to Colombian investigators, had started cooperating with both American and local authorities about surviving cartel connections tied to his mother's old network. In 2008, that decision caught up to him. On May 29th, Osvaldo left a car wash near Belén, neighborhood of Medellin. 2 men on motorcycles pulled up beside his SUV. They fired a burst of automatic rounds through the window, killing him instantly. Witnesses told the police. The gunman shouted his nickname before fleeing into traffic. Investigators immediately suspected a revenge hit linked to his cooperation, not against a rival gang, but against what remained of his mother's empire. The murder bore all the trademarks of a professional Sicario job: close range, daytime, multiple shooters, 0 arrests. The local tabloids called it the Godmother's Revenge. American prosecutors declined to comment publicly, but internal Colombian police reports later surfaced noting Osvaldo's recent contact with U.S. anti-narcotics agents. Whether he was formally cooperating or simply being watched remains unclear. What's certain is that he became the 4th of Blanco's sons to die by gunfire. His death effectively ended her bloodline inside Colombia. 4 years later, in 2012, Griselda Blanco herself was assassinated outside a butcher shop in Medellin, killed in the same manner she had once ordered on others. The drag racing legend Mickey Thompson and his wife Trudy were gunned down in the driveway of their Los Angeles home in 1988. It was a professional job. 2 shooters, silenced pistols, nothing stolen. For years, the case stayed cold until a man who once helped plan the hit started talking. That man was Ronald Stevens, a small-time contractor and longtime friend of Michael Goodwin, Thompson's former business partner. The 2 men had fallen out over money. Thompson accused Goodwin of embezzlement and beat him in court. Investigators believed Goodwin wanted revenge, but they had no physical evidence, just rumors, and Stevens' guilty conscience. In the late 1990s, Stevens approached detectives and admitted that Goodwin had tried to recruit him years earlier for a collection job. He told them he'd backed out when he realized the target was Thompson. He remembered the planning meetings, the cash advances, the threats if he ever spoke. His cooperation turned the case. In 2001, with Stevens' testimony, prosecutors finally charged Goodwin with double murder. The trial was explosive. Defense attorneys called Stevens a liar. Prosecutors called him the key to a murder-for-hire conspiracy that had haunted LA for over a decade. Goodwin was convicted in 2007 and sentenced to life without parole. Stevens was quietly relocated under the state's witness protection program. But California's protection system wasn't built for long memories. By 2007, rumors began circulating that Stevens had been spotted back in the high desert where he used to live. Within months, he was dead, found shot twice in the chest outside a rented home near Victorville. The crime scene told its own story. No forced entry, no robbery, and a missing cell phone. Detectives ruled it a targeted killing. The gunman was never found. People in the old LA scene said the game finally caught up to him. Not in court, not in headlines, just out there in the dust, where nobody snitches twice. In Vallejo, California, police shootings didn't end with reports of discipline. They ended with a ritual. Each time an officer killed someone in the line of duty, he bent one corner of his badge inward, a private mark of the act. Some badges had 2 folds, others 5. By 2016, the city of 120,000 had one of the highest per capita fatal shooting rates in America. But what startled investigators more than anything was the celebration. A detective first exposed the practice in 2020, claiming he'd watched senior officers line up to have their badges creased in the department parking lot. They called it earning your bend, as close as a uniformed gang could get to a teardrop tattoo. The killings followed a pattern: traffic stop, chase confusion, gunfire. Suspects were almost always unarmed, yet no officer was convicted. When Vallejo's internal affair files were reviewed, auditors found deleted body cam footage, overlapping statements, and supervisors who'd sign off on contradictory reports. One sergeant, later accused of destroying evidence, was also the man rumored to perform the bends. To the public, Vallejo looked like a small-town department under stress, but inside, it operated like a clique, a closed brotherhood defined by shared blood. A former captain described it plainly. They're not cops anymore. They're a gang with badges. By 2021, city leaders ordered an outside audit, but most of the officers involved had already retired or moved to other California departments. The bent badges disappeared into drawers and display cases, untraceable proof of a culture that rewarded kills. For Vallejo, accountability never came. Just the silence that follows when a gang knows how to protect its own. In Los Angeles County, the most feared gang in Compton didn't sell drugs or run corners. It wore uniforms. They called themselves the Executioners, a tattoo clique operating inside the Sheriff's Department Compton station. Each member had matching tattoos, a skull wearing a Nazi-style helmet, an AK-47 at its side, flames rising in the background. The ink was an initiation, and new recruits allegedly earned their tattoo by killing someone in the line of duty. At least 18 deputies were identified as members. Their names appeared in court filings and whistleblower complaints describing a shadow leadership that dictated who got promoted, who got overtime, and who got protection. According to one deputy who testified, there was a quota system. The more aggressive your arrest, the faster your path to respect. Another officer said he was pressured to earn his ink after refusing to take part in a beating. He soon found himself transferred, demoted, and targeted with false write-ups. The clique operated with impunity. Deputies accused of shootings were cleared by internal reviews, led by other executioners. Supervisors who questioned the culture faced retaliation or early retirement. When the story broke in 2020, it sounded like an urban myth. Gang tattoos and kill counts inside the sheriff's department. but leaked audio from a deputy confirmed it. They call themselves the Executioners. They celebrate shootings. Community groups in Compton demanded a federal investigation, citing decades of unpunished brutality. Reporters uncovered similar cliques across the county stations. The Jump Out Boys, the 3000 Boys, the Vikings, each with its own tattoo and initiation ritual. The department called them subcultures. Victims called them what they were: organized crime in uniform. No one was ever charged for belonging to the Executioners. But over the years, lawsuits against its members cost Los Angeles County more than $50 million in settlements. Inside the department, the tattoos remain hidden under sleeves. Outside, they're a reminder that the city once hosted a police gang so confident, it branded itself on the skin of its officers. On the city's west side sits an old brick warehouse that once belonged to Sears. To the Chicago Police Department, it was a narcotics facility, and to the people taken there, it was something closer to a black site. In 2015, The Guardian exposed the facility after tracking the stories of detainees who vanished from official records. They were taken to Homan Square, a building never listed in public arrest logs. Family members and attorneys called precincts, jails, even hospitals, but no one could confirm where their relatives were. Activist Brian Church, arrested during a NATO protest, later said he was handcuffed to a bench for 17 hours and denied food, water, or legal counsel. Another man, Corey Wright, recalled being blindfolded before questioning. John Hubbard died inside the facility under disputed circumstances that police labeled a suicide. Defense lawyers eventually connected hundreds of similar accounts. Suspects were detained for hours or days before formal booking, questioned in rooms without cameras, and released without paperwork if nothing useful came out of them. Others left with bruises and signed confessions. When investigators demanded internal logs, they found entries for more than 7,000 people held at that address, almost all of them black or Latino, and almost none represented by counsel. A federal review never materialized. City officials called the report sensationalized, but no one could explain why the department needed an interrogation site invisible to the court system. Homan Square became shorthand for a deeper problem: a police culture so confident in its own authority that it built the place to make people disappear. The warehouse still stands on South Homan Avenue, quiet and fenced off. To neighbors, the old Sears is a reminder that in Chicago, secrecy can outlast reform. In January 2023, two black men in Rankin County, Mississippi were asleep in their home when a team of white deputies broke through the door without a warrant. They called themselves the Goon Squad, a nickname they'd given their clique within the Rankin County Sheriff's Office. The victims were Michael Corey Jenkins and Eddie Parker. For nearly 2 hours, the deputies beat, tased, and waterboarded them while shouting racial slurs. They poured milk, alcohol, and cooking oil all over the men's heads, forced them to crawl on the floor, and fired their service weapons inside the house to scare them. When Jenkins begged for it to stop, one deputy, Hunter Elwood, put a gun into his mouth and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through his tongue and jaw, leaving him bleeding on the floor. The others scrambled to cover up what they had done. They planted a gun in the house, collected shell casings, and staged photos to make it appear as though Jenkins had fired first. Then they filed false reports claiming the men had resisted arrest. For months, the story might have held until the victims survived and spoke out. The FBI and Department of Justice opened an investigation. By mid-2023, 6 deputies, including Elwood, Christian Dedman, and Daniel Opdyke, were invited on federal civil rights charges. All pleaded guilty. Court documents revealed the Goon Squad had assaulted other residents during illegal searches, often bragging about tuning people up and texting each other about their night hunts. They used group chats to share violent memes and photos of their victims. According to prosecutors, they saw themselves as enforcers, a private gang operating inside the badge. When federal agents confronted them, one deputy admitted the group had a common rule: never report another member. Even the sheriff's leadership allegedly ignored earlier complaints about their conduct. In August 2024, 5 of the deputies were sentenced to between 10 and 40 years in federal prison. Jenkins, now permanently disfigured, said in court, "They did what they did because they thought nobody would ever make them pay." The case shook Mississippi. For years, the Goon Squad treated rural raids as sport. It ended only when one of their victims lived long enough to tell the story. In 2016, Oakland's police chief abruptly resigned after a scandal that would take down 3 chiefs in 9 days. The reason wasn't corruption in the usual sense. It was the exposure of a sex trafficking network that thrived in plain sight, protected by officers themselves. The center of it all was a young woman who went by the name Celeste Watt. She was 17 when she first came into contact with Oakland officers. According to her testimony, she was exploited by more than a dozen law enforcement officers across multiple departments in the Bay Area, including Oakland, Richmond, and Livermore. Some officers paid her for sex. Others tipped her off about prostitution stings so she could avoid arrest. One exchanged information about undercover operations in return for nude photos. In text messages later obtained by investigators, an Oakland officer joked, "You're my confidential informant and my side chick." When an internal review began, at least 14 officers were implicated. One of them, Officer Brendan O'Brien, was found dead from an apparent suicide shortly after investigators questioned him. His death set off a chain reaction. More names surfaced, and the department's command structure began to collapse. Within a single week, 3 successive police chiefs were forced out, one after another, as the scandal spread to neighboring cities. Each insisted the department could move forward. None lasted long enough to prove it. Oakland's mayor described it as toxic culture meeting institutional blindness. For years, officers had treated the young woman as both a source and a possession, passing her between jurisdictions while maintaining a wall of silence. When the district attorney's office reviewed the case, most of the implicated officers escaped felony charges. Several resigned or were fired. Only a few faced misdemeanor convictions. The city later paid nearly $1 million in settlements to the victim. The episode revealed an older truth about Oakland's police force. Its corruption was about entitlement, the belief that power guaranteed access. In Atlanta, the most feared police squad wasn't a SWAT team or a task force. It was a street unit called Red Dog, short for Run Every Drug Dealer Out of Georgia. Created in the 1980s to fight the crack epidemic, Red Dog survived long past its purpose. By the 2010s, it had become a symbol of humiliation and street-level control. Residents compared their tactics to military raids. They would storm apartment complexes, order men to the ground, and conduct full-body searches in public. A 2010 investigation found that dozens of officers in the unit had prior misconduct complaints, including excessive force, illegal searches, and assault. One woman said officers dragged her half-naked into the street during a raid. Another man described being kicked in the face after already being handcuffed. But the scandal that finally ended Red Dog began at a gay bar called The Eagle. In September 2009, officers raided the club during a routine check for liquor violations. Patrons were forced to lie on the floor, while officers used homophobic slurs and threatened to bash their heads in. No drugs were found, no arrests were made, and the raid triggered national outrage. City leaders promised an overhaul, but Red Dog's defenders insisted the unit's aggression was necessary. Then, within months, more brutality complaints surfaced, beatings captured on cell phones, lawsuits filed by families, settlements paid by the city. By early 2011, Mayor Kasim Reed announced the unit's disbandment, but the disbandment was largely symbolic. Within a few years, Atlanta launched a near-identical successor, the Apex Unit, tasked again with high-intensity patrols in poor neighborhoods. Many of the same officers transferred over. The legacy of Red Dog never disappeared. It became a blueprint recycled across the country. Aggressive street policing rebranded under new names. Memphis called theirs Scorpion. Nashville had Flex. Each carried the same reputation: hard stops, broken bones, and lawsuits that cost cities millions. In Atlanta, the badge still carried weight, but Red Dog's shadow lingered. When you control the city through fear, you don't need to wear colors, only the authority to act without consequence. In Baltimore, a city already bleeding from the wounds of crime and corruption, a specialized police unit was created to wage war against illegal guns and violent gangs. But instead of upholding the law, these officers decided they were the law. They ran the streets like mobsters, robbing dealers, reselling drugs, and even planting guns on the people they brutalized. This is the story of the Gun Trace Task Force, one of the most corrupt police units in American history. Baltimore, Maryland, a city infamous for its high crime rates, drug epidemics, and police force under constant scrutiny. In the early 2000s, the city's murder rate was among the highest in the nation, and law enforcement was desperate for a solution. The Gun Trace Task Force was formed with a clear mission: take illegal guns off the streets and dismantle violent crime networks. For a while it worked, or at least that's how it seemed. Officers were seizing weapons, making arrests, and racking up stats that made headlines. But behind the scenes, something sinister was brewing. They weren't just fighting crime, they were running it. The streets talk, and soon, the streets of Baltimore were buzzing with whispers of dirty cops. Dealers and suspects spoke of officers robbing them for their drugs and loot, even shaking down rival gangs and redistributing power in the underworld. But for the victims, there was no recourse, because who do you report corrupt police officers to? It was a perfect crime, until one routine bust cracked wide open. 2015, a heroin dealer named Aaron Anderson was under surveillance by Detective David McDougall of the Harford County Sheriff's Department. McDougall placed a GPS tracker under Anderson's car, intending to follow his movements. But when officers eventually stopped Anderson, they found two trackers. One was theirs. The other, it belonged to a member of the GTTF. Anderson had been robbed days earlier by men who had entered his home like a SWAT team. They stole nearly 1 kilogram of heroin, cash, a high-end watch, and a firearm. The robbery had felt like a police raid, because it was one. And these officers weren't just tracking dealers, they were tracking targets, choosing who to rob, when to strike, and how to cover their tracks. McDougall's investigation led to a shocking discovery. The Gun Trace Task Force wasn't about stopping crime. Instead, it was running a sophisticated mafia-style operation inside the Baltimore Police Department. The FBI launched an investigation. Wiretaps were placed. Officers were watched. And one by one, the police fell into place. The ringleader? Sergeant Wayne Jenkins, a man who wore the badge but operated like a kingpin. Under his leadership, the GTTF wasn't just corrupt, it was an organized crime syndicate. Jenkins and his crew had it all figured out. They carried fake guns to plant on unarmed victims in case they needed to justify a shooting. They targeted suspects they knew had money and drugs, raiding homes without warrants. They stole from criminals and innocent civilians alike, pocketing cash, Rolex watches, and designer jewelry. They resold stolen drugs back into the streets through a bail bondsman named Donald Stepp, effectively keeping the cycle of crime alive while profiting from it. They falsified overtime reports, often doubling their salaries by claiming to be on duty while they were out robbing people. One of their most audacious heists? Breaking open a safe filled with $200,000 in cash and 2 kilograms of cocaine. They took half the money and all the drugs, then resealed the safe and filmed themselves opening it for the first time, faking an honest bust for the cameras. In 2017, the first indictments were handed down. 13 officers faced charges ranging from racketeering and robbery to extortion and drug distribution. Wayne Jenkins, 25 years. Daniel Herschel and Marcus Taylor, 18 years each. Mamodu Gondo, 10 years, released in 2024. Jamel Ram, 12 years. Thomas Allers, 15 years. Several other officers cut plea deals and received lesser sentences. The scandal rocked Baltimore. forcing the city to pay out over $13 million in settlements to victims. But beyond the financial loss, the real damage was to the trust between the people and the police. Cases had to be dismissed, convictions were overturned, and the Baltimore Police Department, already struggling with credibility, was left in shambles. So what happens now? Most of these officers are still behind bars, but some have already been released, slipping back into society as if nothing ever happened. For the victims, justice may have been served, but does it feel like justice? And the real question remains, if this was happening in Baltimore, where else is this happening right now?